On December 30th, 2025, Saudi Arabia bombed Yemen. That is not unusual. Saudi Arabia has been bombing Yemen since 2015. What was unusual? What was, in the words of one analyst, unprecedented, is who they were bombing. Saudi jets struck forces backed by the United Arab Emirates, their partner, their fellow GCC member, their neighbor with whom they share the most important bilateral relationship in the Arab world, Mukalla, a Yemeni port city. Saudi bombs, UAE-backed fighters, killed. 3 weeks later, the UAE withdrew all its forces from Yemen. 4 months after that, in the middle of an active war between Iran and the United States, the UAE quit OPEC on the same day Saudi Arabia's crown prince was hosting a Gulf summit in Jeddah, without warning, without consultation, without giving the Saudis a phone call first. The most important bilateral relationship in the Arab world is not just strained. It is, according to Baker Institute fellow Christian Ulrichsen, in a stage where things may not go back to normal. This is the full story. Saudi Arabia and the UAE have, on paper, almost everything in common. They share a 457-kilometer land border. They share the same religion, the same Arab identity, the same dependence on oil exports, and the same fundamental security threat, Iran. They are both ruled by authoritarian, modernizing, ambitious leaders. Both have sovereign wealth funds worth trillions. Both want to be the dominant power in the post-oil Gulf. That last sentence is where the problem begins. For most of the GCC's history since 1981, Saudi Arabia was unambiguously the dominant power. Larger, richer in absolute terms, the home of Islam's two holiest cities, the de facto leader of Arab politics. The UAE was wealthy, extraordinarily wealthy, per capita the wealthiest country in the region, but politically subordinate, a smaller partner, a junior ally. Then 2 things happened. Dubai became the financial and tourist capital of the Arab world, challenging Riyadh's claim to regional primacy on the global stage, and Mohammed bin Zayed emerged as one of the most strategically sophisticated leaders in the region, a man who normalized with Israel before Saudi Arabia did, who pivoted toward India before Saudi Arabia thought about it, who built the Abraham Accords framework that made Abu Dhabi a diplomatic player in its own right. And then Mohammed bin Salman arrived, younger, more aggressive, more publicly ambitious. A prince who wanted Saudi Arabia to do everything the UAE had done, but bigger, faster, and with more global prestige. Sports, tourism, technology, entertainment, NEOM, Live Golf, and Abraham Accords 2.0, a Saudi-Israel normalization that MBS positioned as the biggest diplomatic achievement of the century. 2 ambitious leaders, 2 countries competing for the same investors, the same airlines, the same multinational headquarters, the same global prestige, and the same position as the dominant power in a Gulf that is being permanently reshaped by the Iran war. That is the background. Now let's trace the specific events that turned competition into confrontation. The most concrete expression of the Saudi-UAE rift before the Iran war was Yemen. And the Yemen story is the one that turned a diplomatic rivalry into something that looked briefly like the beginning of a proxy conflict. Both Saudi Arabia and the UAE entered Yemen's civil war in 2015 as allies, fighting against the Houthi movement. But their objectives were never fully aligned. Saudi Arabia wanted a unified Yemen governed by the Saudi-backed Presidential Leadership Council with a secure southern border. The UAE wanted strategic influence over Yemen's southern ports and shipping lanes, access to the Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea, and it achieved that by building and supporting the Southern Transitional Council, a separatist movement seeking independence for South Yemen. In December 2025, the STC launched a major offensive and seized the resource-rich Hadramaut and Al-Mahra provinces, both directly bordering Saudi Arabia's southern frontier. Saudi Arabia viewed this as an existential threat, and on December 30th, 2025, the Saudi-led coalition bombed the port city of Mukalla, targeting what it described as weapons shipments from the UAE intended for the STC. Further Saudi strikes on January 2, 2026, reportedly killed 20 STC fighters. Let me be precise about what that means. Saudi Arabia, a country that has never, even at the worst of Gulf tensions, bombed forces aligned with a fellow GCC member, launched airstrikes that killed UAE-backed fighters. On January 2nd, the STC announced a 2-year transition toward an independence referendum for South Yemen. On January 3rd, the UAE withdrew all its remaining forces from Yemen entirely. CSIS noted the historical weight of this. Even at the worst of Gulf tensions during the Qatar blockade in 2017, Saudi Arabia never bombed UAE allied forces. This was a new category of confrontation, and Christian Ulrichsen of the Baker Institute described its significance precisely. Containment measures between the two countries were no longer working. And that was before the Iran war even started. When the U.S. and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury on February 28th, Saudi Arabia and the UAE found themselves in the same position they had been in since the GCC was founded, nominally allied, hosting American forces, sharing a common Iranian threat, but their responses to the war revealed how completely their strategic calculations had diverged. MBZ, the UAE president, had lobbied Trump against launching the war. He feared the consequences, and specifically that Iran would strike UAE territory, that the Abraham Accords framework would be destabilized, and that Dubai's model of stable investment-driven growth would be shattered by regional conflict. When the war began anyway, MBZ pivoted. He wanted it fought to a decisive finish. A weakened Iran, a Hezbollah stripped of its weapons, a Gulf where Iranian missiles could never again reach Emirati soil. MBS had the opposite trajectory. Initially supportive, he believed the war could serve Saudi interests by degrading Iran's military and proxy network. But within weeks, as Iranian missiles began striking Saudi Red Sea infrastructure, as Vision 2030's investment pipeline showed signs of stress, as oil revenues were disrupted despite elevated prices, MBS shifted toward pushing for an off-ramp, a negotiated settlement, a restoration of the pre-war status quo, minus, ideally, some of Iran's military capability. Two leaders, same war, opposite conclusions about how to end it. And when MBS hosted a Gulf summit in Jeddah to coordinate a regional response, the UAE delivered its verdict on the entire framework with a single announcement. It quit OPEC. Without telling him. The OPEC exit is not just an economic decision, it's a declaration of strategic independence. UAE Energy Minister Suhail al-Mazrouei posted the announcement on X. He described it as reflecting long-term policy considerations and sector policy-driven developments consistent with long-term market fundamentals. The substance underneath that language is anything but measured. With the UAE's departure, OPEC now has 11 active members: Algeria, Congo, Equatorial Guinea, Gabon, Libya, Nigeria, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela. The UAE, which has long been regarded as one of OPEC's most stable and reliable members, is gone. The UAE believes oil demand will start falling due to the energy transition sooner than Saudi Arabia believes, and it wants to monetize its reserves as fast as possible while prices are high. Saudi Arabia's entire OPEC strategy depends on limiting supply to keep prices elevated. The UAE's strategy is to maximize volume. Those two strategies cannot coexist inside the same cartel. The UAE is publicly choosing its economic model over its alliance with Riyadh, and it is doing so at the moment of maximum Gulf crisis, when coordination would be most valuable and the signal would carry the most weight. The two competing Gulf blocs are now openly identified, and they're pulling in opposite directions on the Abraham Accords. Saudi Arabia had always been the key to Abraham Accords 2.0, the next stage of Israeli-Arab normalization. If Riyadh signed, every other holdout in the Arab world would follow, and MBS had been positioning himself as the Arab leader willing to do it, for the right price, at the right political moment. The UAE-Saudi rift complicates that profoundly. Saudi Arabia's Abraham Accords normalization was always tied to UAE-style relationships, commercial, strategic, forward-looking. If the UAE and Saudi Arabia are now competing blocs rather than complementary pillars, Saudi Arabia's domestic political calculation for normalization becomes harder. Moving toward Israel was always going to cost MBS religiously and politically. Moving toward Israel while simultaneously being seen as following the UAE's path, while publicly feuding with Abu Dhabi over OPEC, Yemen, and the war, would cost him even more. The UAE signed the accords in 2020. Saudi Arabia was supposed to follow. With the rift now public, that sequencing is no longer guaranteed. The competition for investment, airlines, headquarters, and global prestige has no natural resolution. Both Saudi Arabia and the UAE are simultaneously trying to attract global investment, build world-class airlines, draw tourists, become AI and logistics hubs, and diversify away from oil. They are competing for the same investors, the same sovereign wealth fund partnerships, the same multinational headquarters decisions, the same Formula One sponsorships and golf tournaments and tech conferences. Before the Iran war, that competition was managed, kept within a framework of GCC solidarity and shared security interests. The Yemen confrontation cracked that framework. The Iran war shattered it. And the OPEC exit removed the last formal institutional mechanism for coordination between Riyadh and Abu Dhabi on the issue that most defines both economies. The Middle East in 2026 will be defined by how Abu Dhabi and Riyadh manage their growing, now public rivalry, with bombs having fallen on UAE-backed forces by Saudi jets, with the UAE having quit the cartel Saudi Arabia leads, with two alliance blocs forming around competing external partners. The relationship has crossed into new territory. The question is not whether the rift is real, it is whether it is reversible. Saudi Arabia and the UAE together hold roughly 15 to 20% of the world's proven oil reserves. Their sovereign wealth funds collectively manage more than $2 trillion in global assets. Their decisions about where to invest, which alliances to build, which external powers to partner with, and how to manage their oil production shape global energy markets, global capital flows, and the geopolitical architecture of the Middle East. A divided Gulf, with Saudi Arabia in one strategic bloc and the UAE in another, is a Gulf where OPEC is weaker, where GCC solidarity is hollow, where external powers have every incentive to play one state against the other, and where the security architecture that America depends on for its Middle East posture is built on cracked foundations. For China, a divided Gulf is an opportunity to deepen relationships with both states simultaneously. For Russia, the same logic applies. For Turkey, Qatar, and Pakistan, the countries in Saudi Arabia's emerging bloc, the rift gives them leverage they have not previously had in Gulf politics. For the Iran negotiations currently underway, a fractured Gulf is a weaker negotiating partner for Washington. If Saudi Arabia and the UAE are pulling in different directions on what a post-war Gulf looks like, the U.S. loses the unified Arab support that would give a deal more regional legitimacy. And for the post-war reconstruction that whoever negotiates the Iran deal will eventually have to address, Dubai and Abu Dhabi's investment capacity, Saudi Arabia's petrodollar flows, and the GCC's collective economic weight are all potentially required to stabilize the post-war Gulf. None of that works if the two most powerful players in the region are competing rather than cooperating. The Iran war created the crisis. The Saudi-UAE rift may determine whether the Gulf can recover from it. Saudi Arabia and the UAE still share a border, billions in trade, American security guarantees, and the same Iranian threat. The Yemen confrontation ended with the STC reportedly disbanding and the UAE withdrawing. It did not produce a permanent military standoff. UAE officials have spoken publicly about the OPEC decision being a policy and economic choice, not a political statement. Saudi officials have maintained that the GCC framework is intact. The rift is real. But it is a rift between partners who share more common interests than they share conflicts. The question is whether the common interests still outweigh the divergences, or whether 2026, with an active war, a broken OPEC, bombed STC forces, and two competing alliance blocs, has shifted that balance definitively. The Baker Institute's most measured assessment, containment is no longer working. That is not the same as saying the relationship is beyond repair. It is saying that the tools that previously kept the rivalry manageable have run out of effectiveness. On December 30th, 2025, Saudi Arabia bombed UAE-backed fighters in Yemen. On January 3, 2026, the UAE withdrew its forces from the country entirely. On February 28th, the Iran war began, and the two leaders took diametrically opposite positions on how to fight it and when to end it. On May 1st, the UAE quit OPEC without warning Saudi Arabia. On the same day, MBS was hosting a Gulf summit in Jeddah. The GCC now sits with 11 OPEC members instead of 12. Two emerging alliance blocs are crystallizing across a region that has been, for 40 years, defined by Saudi-UAE partnership. The Abraham Accords 2.0 is under new political pressure. Two sovereign wealth funds worth trillions are now investing with different strategic logics. MBZ and MBS have not spoken publicly about each other since the OPEC exit. Their governments have maintained diplomatic language, and both are currently dealing with the aftermath of a war that struck their infrastructure, disrupted their oil revenues, and demonstrated that neither one of them is fully safe behind their American security guarantees. They bombed each other's allies in Yemen. They quit the same oil cartel that defined their relationship for decades. They are now building different alliance networks, pursuing different energy strategies, and responding to the same Iranian threat with different strategic calculations. The Gulf's most important relationship is not over, but it is no longer what it was. And what it becomes will matter more than almost any other geopolitical variable in the years ahead. And the world is watching what happens next.